Have you ever heard of the expression, if you want something done, go, if not, send? Why is it often better to do important tasks by ourselves instead of delegating them? There's a mismatch of interest between us, the principal, with our interest, and the one who has to carry out a task, the agent, with probably another interest. This misalignment is commonly known as the principal-agent problem, a hurdle we all face in our daily lives. In this video, we will look at how we can bridge the asymmetry of interest between the principal and the agent with incentives and skin in the game. We have on the one hand the principal, who gives the task to the agent. The agent has to do the task. Frequently, what happens now is that the agent pursues his or her own interest, which leads to the core dilemma explored in this theory. Let's look at a definition in the context of a company by Naval Ravikant. A principal is an owner. An agent works for the owner, so you can think of an agent as an employee. The difference between a founder and an employee is the difference between a principal and an agent. I can summarize the principal-agent problem with a famous quote attributed to Napoleon or Julius Caesar. If you want it done, go. If not, send. Which is to say, if you want to do something right, do it yourself, because other people just don't care enough, by Naval Ravikant. This problem is important for us to understand, because every task we delegate in our daily lives can be made not as we want it to be. I find it an important heuristic to be aware of advisors and other people who do tasks for us or who help us with making decisions, because everyone has his or her own interest in this transaction or in this communication or in this contract. We want the outcome to be good, but our advisors are probably more focused on the money they get per hour or something like that. So it's really important to watch at the interest of both parties. Let's say we want to align both interests, the interest between the principal and agent. How do we do that? We can focus on getting the incentives right. Naval Ravikant on exactly this from a perspective of a business owner. Almost all human behavior can be explained by incentives. The study of signaling is seeing what people do despite what they say. People are much more honest with their actions than they are with their words. You have to get the incentives right to get people to behave correctly. You're always going to be trying to figure out, how do I make this person think like me? How do I incent them? How do I give them founder mentality? By Naval Ravikant. Incentives such as rewards or punishments are factors that motivate individuals to do a certain action. They play a crucial role in our human behavior. The iron rule of nature is that you get what you reward for. If you want ants to come, put sugar on the floor, by Charlie Munger. Let's take a stockbroker for example. They are not paid for how good their advice on a certain company or stock to buy is, but rather on how many transactions they do. So as a client, when we go to a stockbroker, we want to have good options of companies to buy. But we have to realize that the stockbroker is not necessarily paid for that. He or she is more paid for the transactions the client is doing. So the interests are a little bit off. They are misaligned, and there comes the asymmetry. The client wants something else than the stockbroker. So it's really helpful to be aware of that. Warren Buffett here with another example. If you go to a dentist who gets paid by the number of teeth he pulls out, you better think ahead about what teeth you want to be pulled out, by Warren Buffett. Here again we can see the asymmetry of what the client's interests are and what the agent's interests are. When the dentist is paid for pulling out the most number of teeth, it is most likely not in the client's interest. Now we go back to our questions. How do we align interest? In general, we can align interest if we give the principal and the agent similar personal responsibility and similar exposure to the up and downside of a certain action or of a certain advice. In our book, alignment means being a partner in both directions, not just on the upside. Many alignment plans flunk this basic test, being artful forms of heads I win, tails you lose. When an executive only has upside and no downside, it will always lead to excessive risk-taking, by Warren Buffett. Taking personal responsibility for the actions one does or the words one speaks, and having exposure to the consequences is a concept of skin in the game, which we will talk about in the next chapter. We talked about a positive signal in the form of incentives. Now we will switch to the probably stronger signal, a negative signal, in the form of disincentives. Let's look here at an old law called Hammurabi's Law. If a builder builds a house for a man and does not make its construction sound, and the house which he has built collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, the builder shall be put to death. In a Modern Way by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. To me, every opinion maker needs to have skin in the game in the event of harm caused by reliance on his information or opinion. Further, anyone producing a forecast or making an economic analysis needs to have something to lose from it, given that others rely on those forecasts. By Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Let's take now a concrete example where the agent has no skin in the game, meaning here, in our case, is not faced with a potential downside. There's a difference between a manager running a company that is not his own and an owner-operated business in which the manager does not need to report numbers to anyone but himself, and for which he has a downside. Corporate managers have incentives without disincentives, something the general public doesn't quite get, as they have the illusion that managers are properly incentivized. By Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Some minutes ago we looked at a quote from Warren Buffett where he talks about the heads I win, tails you lose concept, so to speak, which he by himself criticized. And this is really fundamentally flawed, because in our case now, the corporate manager, when a year is good or someone makes a good decision or he or she makes a good decision, they collect bonuses. The corporate manager collect bonuses. But when there's a bad year or a bad decision is made, often what happens to them is nothing. So they are connected to the upside, but not connected to the downside. And this is fundamentally flawed and unethical, because the downside often gets distributed to the whole company, in our case a company, and everyone has to suffer except probably a higher corporate manager. And this is not the case with the business owner, because the business owner, or like the manager who is the business owner, because the company is basically the manager. And the manager is, so to speak, also totally faced with all the downside. Another example. We, as the voters, are the principal, and the elected representative is the agent, who, from our perspective, should push through our interests in government. Now, the problem is that the elected person has his or her own interest to push through. This we could deal with incentives. The incentive in our case was or is actually the vote. Now, what if the representative makes a wrong decision that goes against the principal? Or in our case, ourselves and our ideas, mostly, they get no punishment. The extra cost of something, or let's say in a wrong decision, gets often thrown at the taxpayer, while the government agents take their checks normally. This transfer of downside, this not taking responsibility, can lead to more risk-taking on the part of the agent, and this often goes against the interest of the principal. And this creates the big asymmetry between the interest of the principal and the interest of the agent. With skin in the game, on the other hand, the agent faces more up and down sides, or in our case more downsides, and can be somewhat made responsible for their actions or their words, which aligns the interest between the principal and agent much better. Imagine someone who votes for war and, because of skin in the game, has to go to war by him or herself. This person would think much more about the vote itself. Now, a last ethical maxim to consider. Do not treat others the way you would not like them to treat you. The Silver Rule, paraphrased by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. What I learned personally from this episode today is to walk the talk. I'm in a position with this YouTube channel to somehow give advice, or better to say, to communicate advice from others. But as a rule, I gave myself to just talk about things or concepts which I know a lot about, or it's not just about knowing, it's also about doing things. The same with mental models. Like, I can only talk about them if I really experience them, if I really tried them out. And I think that is really important, to not talk about something or give advice about something which we never tried out, because doing is something different than talking. And the same goes with skin in the game, because when I feel much better when I give advice or give like tips or whatever, when I had previously experienced this by myself. I had skin in the game. I faced the downside. When I just talk about something what another person talked about, what sounds okay, sounds logical and probably valuable, but I don't even know the implications or the consequences of this advice, I can actually not talk about. And probably we all can think about those situations. Even in many cases, we want to give well-meaning advice, but in many cases also we didn't walk the talk. So we didn't experience this, like we didn't do this advice by ourselves. So maybe we can think all about it a little bit. At least I thought about it, and I have to much more be in this doing and this experiencing area than just in this talking. Thank you so much for watching this video today. And as always, I wish you a fantastic day.